Okay, so here's the beginning of our video lecture. I apologize that this didn't get up in when I thought it would. Things just got a little bit out of hand, but everything's all right, and I should have it up by about 11 o'clock tonight on Thursday. So what we're going to be doing in this video lecture is we're going to be doing our northern part of our comparison of North and South. And if you remember, we're going to be looking at the economic development of the North, and then we'll be looking at society and culture. And as I go through this, I'll be making sure that you understand how the North is different from the South, and you'll be able to sort of take a look at the differences between these, and hopefully that will lead to an understanding of sort of why the North and South were so different socially and got to the point where they saw each other as enemies. So hopefully you have printed out and have with you the template that you need to do for the 5 points that are required. And if you turn this in on Monday, the extra 10 points that you'll get an extra credit. So take those notes, fill them in as the lecture goes along. I noted the slides in order so you know when slides are going to change, and you should have space to do the writing from what I talk about on the notes. Okay, so let's go. So the North and the Market Revolution. So as we did with the South, we're going to be looking at economic changes and their impact in the North. So let's take a look at a certain set of changes that are taking place in when we talked about the South, we talked about the cotton gin and said the cotton gin made one change that kept the South the same. Well, now what we're going to do is we're going to look at a lot of changes that happen in the North. And by the time you're done, you'll realize how very different the North was by 1860 than the South was. And the first thing that was a change was something called the Transportation Revolution. The Transportation Revolution took the American economy from being what we call an island economy, which looks something like this, where you have local communities that engage in trade through barter. They might have some economic development within these local communities, but they're very distant from each other and they're not connected, as this will show you. There is a lack of what we call infrastructure. Roads, canals, railroads, those kinds of links that allow people to move back and forth, but also goods and services. So in 1790, what we had really was an island economy, places where local trade happened, but we didn't have widespread development. But by the beginning of the 1820s, we're going to see the building of infrastructure, the transportation revolution, turning America's economy into a common market. Well, I shouldn't say America, I should say the North, because as you'll see, the South isn't going to participate in this very much. So what looked like this with the building of infrastructure is going to look like this. Okay, so now we have connections between each other. And this here, the local community that barters and trade may still do that, but they'll also be trading goods with other people. Okay, so let's look at how this infrastructure is built. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at different kinds of infrastructure that is built during this period of time. So let's take a look at infrastructure. So the question during the 1810s, 20s, and 30s was, what will we build? And the answer, of course, is going to be roads and canals, which is what we'll be looking at. And we'll look at each of those in order. But there was also a debate about who would pay for this. Would this be private roads? Would it be paid for by a city? Would it be paid for by the state? Or would the national government step in its desire to help the American economy and pay for some of this? Well, let's look at this. The answer actually to who pays is all of the above in different ways. So let's look at roads as an example of this. So the first roads that were built during the United States period, the early national period, were what were called turnpikes. A turnpike is simply a road, but it is a specific kind of road. It's a toll road. So if you've ever been like on a bridge over to San Francisco, or if you've ever driven around back east, you know what a turnpike is. It's a toll road where you have to pay money to go on that road. And beginning in the 1790s, many private companies decided that they wanted to invest in creating turnpikes. So it would be like people in Modesto decided that they wanted to build a road between Modesto and Ceres. They build the road. It's a nice road. It's better than the road that exists, which is probably just a little kind of pathway. And so people say, wow, this will be cool. I can drive my wagon on this turnpike and I just have to pay a little bit of money. Those are hugely successful, connecting local communities together. Okay, so turnpikes are the start. The problem with turnpikes is those investors kind of forgot that some of their profit needed to be put into maintenance of the road. And so over time, turnpikes tended to fail because they didn't put money into maintenance. And if I'm driving from Modesto to Ceres and that road I have to pay for is a really crummy road and that path over there is free, I think I might just use the path. And so turnpikes were an experiment, but they're not going to last too long. They'll come back later, but for now, they're going to go out of business. And what's going to replace them are roads that are built by states and the national government. And so let's look at both of these. And the first one we're going to look at is really the most famous road of this period, and that's called the National Road. And if you look at the map there, I've just shown you two arrows that show you it begins in Baltimore and it ends way out in the west, out at St. Louis. The National Road was begun in 1790 over there in Baltimore, and it took until 1852 to finish the road. And the reason for that is twofold. One, it was actually for the first time an engineered road. And if you look at this painting here, this is a painting from 1823 showing workers working on the National Road. This was not just a road made of dirt. They actually put stones down and tried to cover the stones. They engineered ways for water to flow off the road so it would stay in place. And in fact, much of the engineering of the National Road was so good that when they replaced the National Road with a highway, Highway 66, which replaced it, they really didn't have to do a lot of changes to the engineering. That's how well it was made. The National Road was a road that for local areas provided trade connections, but ultimately the National Road became much more well known as a road of migration. If you were somebody heading to the west in the 1840s, it's pretty likely that your wagon was on the National Road as you made your way out to the jumping off point, say, to the Oregon Trail, okay, which would have started way out here past St. Louis. Okay, so the National Road, paid for by Congress, providing a large-scale road that connects large areas together. But states tended to pay for more local roads or regional roads. One really big example is the Natchez Trace, which is one of the very few southern roads that is built. So the Natchez Trace goes here. Here is a modern picture of the Natchez Trace restored to its original state. This is in the national park, the Natchez Trace National Park. And you can see that this road is a little bit different than this road. This road, as was true with many state roads, remained dirt. They were often unnavigable during certain periods of time, but they served the first purpose of connecting localities together. So states and Congress paid for roads, and you can see some of those roads on this map. Some of these smaller red lines are smaller roads that you can see that are connecting people together. Okay, so that's roads. The other way to get around, and really the way that people got around better than any way else, true in colonial times, true today, were water routes. Water is always a very cheap and relatively easy way to get places, except that water has some problems. The problem with water routes is water routes until the 1820s and 30s were all rivers. And rivers are a problem because rivers only go one direction, and they only go where the rivers flow. You can't make a river go where you want it, okay, especially not back then. So rivers were kind of a problem until 1809, very early in the transportation revolution, with the invention of the steamboat. The steamboat was enormously significant, especially on rivers like the Mississippi and the Ohio, because that allowed goods to be shipped downriver, which was always easily and cheap to do. But it also allowed the shipment upriver. Prior to the steamboat, you had to literally drag barges filled with goods up the river against the current. And that was very difficult, very long, and very expensive. So the steamboat, invented by Robert Fulton in 1809, an American, was a huge transportation change. Particularly the steamboat was important in the South, and many steamboats were the first step of cotton that was going off to England. It would be taken to a boat, the cotton would be placed on it, and off it would go. And in fact, if you look right here, this is supposed to be some bales of cotton on this painting. Okay, so rivers get better because of steamboats, but still, they don't go where you want. That problem is solved with the canal era, which begins with the beginning of the building of the Erie Canal in 1817 and really begins to end in 1860. Some historians say it was a little bit earlier than that. We're just going to cut it off right about the beginning of the Civil War. What canals do is become movable rivers. A canal is a way of moving goods, not irrigation like we think out today. Out here, it's dry. We need irrigation, and so we have small canals. Canals were actually bodies of water that were generally 12 feet wide and 4 feet deep and connected other bodies of water together where you want. So what you can do is you can take a river and you can connect a canal to it, use the water in that canal to fill the river to fill the canal, put that canal anywhere you want to connect to another body of water, and now you have your own river where you want it to go. What that does is it links communities together in places that are not along river routes. Traditionally, people lived along rivers because water was the easiest way to move goods. But now communities that have no connection to a water network will be connected together. So all of this began with the building of the Erie Canal, which is a New York project paid for by the state of New York and built primarily by them. It took them from 1817 until 1825 to build the Erie Canal. And you can see, I'll show you a couple things and I'll show you a little bit more here later. But if you look up here on this map, the Erie Canal is up here. So this map is up here, okay? It sits completely in New York, but it connects, and as in the canal era and the canal craze, you can see here's the Erie Canal, okay? But many, many other canals are going to be built to connect into the water network that the Erie Canal creates. So this waterway, which is 363 miles long, will connect, and if you look at this map I'll show you, this is the Hudson River, okay, right here, which flows down to New York City. The Erie Canal connects the Hudson River all the way out to Buffalo, New York, to Lake Erie. Lake Erie is connected to Lake Huron, which is connected to Lake Michigan, which can take you all the way out to Chicago or anywhere along the way, Toledo, Detroit, Cleveland, Erie, all of these towns are going to grow enormously because now goods can go from New York up the Hudson River, over the Erie Canal, and all the way out to the Midwest. And all of these canals are all connecting all of those goods from this huge waterway out into all of these areas that had not been very well served by rivers. It is an amazing achievement between 1817 and roughly 1840. So let me talk a little bit more about the Erie Canal. Okay, so just so you get the stuff that I just said, the Erie Canal was begun in 1817, finished in 1825, built completely by the state of New York and paid for by them. It extends from Troy, New York, all the way up the Mohawk Valley to Buffalo. This is the one place along the Appalachian Mountains where it's easy to get through And thus the canal is so way far up in New York, because farther south it was really very difficult to build canals. So this is our connection over the Appalachian Mountains and into the Ohio River Valley. Okay. The way the canal worked was it moved locks that filled, would move people up. This is sort of the profile of the land. So you would go on the canal up through locks, you'd go on a straight area, you'd go here, up through locks, and up to the level at Buffalo, and then back down the canal you would go. Okay, so that's the Erie Canal. And all of the canals work this way, with locks that moved barges up and down the river. So what are the consequences of this transportation revolution? Well, the two of them are reduced cost and increased trade. If you look at, this is a map, and you can just look at this really quickly to see the growth of things. So the yellow is canals, and so the Erie Canal's already been built, and people are starting to build into the Erie Canal. Here are roads. Okay, so there's our national road, there's the Natchez Trace, and some of the other major roads. By 1840, you can see that more roads are being built out farther into the west, and you can see that a few more canals have been built. Okay. Railroads are around, but they're very limited, if you notice. Sorry, a fly was just getting me. Okay, and then by 1850, you can see the growth of the networks there. One of the things you should notice is that while roads are being built in the South, you do not see a single canal being built in the South. Okay, and these railroads were just built just in 1850, and they don't exactly go very far. Up here, we're getting these huge networks developing. Okay, so the reduced cost. You can see the connections, which would be increasing in trade, and you can also, if you look at this map, you can see the cost is going down. So in 1800, 1 ton of goods traveling 1 mile costs you 30 cents. Okay. The railroad, which is not going to come around until the 1850s and doesn't go very far, costs you 4 cents, which is pretty cheap, but even a wagon is going to half your price because those roads are there. Water, if you go on water, okay, in 1800 it cost you 7 cents a mile. In 1850, with the invention of the canals, it goes down to 1 cent a mile. And interestingly enough, the steamboat is actually the cheapest form of transportation, but it's not the best, because remember, a steamboat goes on a river and it doesn't go on a canal. It only goes where the river goes. But you can see that transportation of cotton is going to be pretty cheap in the South. Okay, so transportation revolution, or the transportation expansion, plays an important role in changes in the American North, and it's going to lead to the ability to move goods around. Okay, so let's look at the next change. The next change is going to focus on another big change that's taking place with the market revolution, and that is production of goods. And the change that we have is new production methods. Prior to the early 1800s, people made goods. We talked about the local production of goods, but we know that America was really not focused on producing goods. We wanted to trade. We didn't want to produce. Alexander Hamilton was driven crazy by the fact that people didn't want to manufacture goods. But one of the things that's going to begin to change all of that, along with the end of the War of 1812 and the beginning of the transportation revolution, is that people are beginning to think about new ways to produce materials, which might actually make it more interesting and more affordable to produce goods. So let's look at a couple of those. One of the things that is a change is something called the division of labor, which I kind of hesitantly say is the beginning of the assembly line. It's not really an assembly line, but it's kind of the first step that's being taken way before the assembly line is really invented officially. And what the division of labor means is you take the process of building something. So if you're making a shoe, you have to cut out the shape of the shoe, you have to make a sole, you have to sew it all together. And traditionally what people did was one person knew how to do all of that, and that person was called an artisan. But now with the division of labor, what you can do is you can take all of those steps and make them very simple. so that somebody who's not an artisan, just a regular ordinary person, can come in and they can certainly cut out a pattern. That means that that person doesn't have to be paid very much, and the process is faster. So an artisan who is paid more because he has skills is going to take longer and be more expensive. But if I divide up the labor among 4 very cheaply paid people, then that process is faster and it's cheaper, which is a production method that allows you to make lots of cheap goods. The next thing is our inventions. There are many, many inventions that Americans and others are coming up with during this period of time. And what I'm going to do is give you a very, very tiny sample of some of these inventions. The one on the top right here with the blue background, you can probably guess, is the sewing machine. The sewing machine was sort of officially invented in the United States by Isaac Singer in 1845. There had been other sort of sewing machines before this, but Isaac Singer is credited with sort of putting the pieces together and making a sewing machine that can very effectively and relatively quickly, even though it's run by hand, sew fabric together. Another invention that I want to draw your attention to is down here. This is a telegraph. This is a machine that does Morse code for the telegraph. The telegraph was invented the same year as the sewing machine. And I draw your attention to that because up until now I've been talking about connecting us together in terms of physically, roads, canals, and so forth. But Morse code and the telegraph also allows people to communicate faster, which is good for business. I can telegraph somebody and I can talk to them about a business deal. It allows people to know a lot more about what's going on in places outside their own communities, which is very significant. If roads connect us physically together, the telegraph connects us socially together. So these are 2 inventions among very many that are part of the market revolution. Another significant invention, again, something that had been going on before, but one man is going to make this more significant in the United States, and he's somebody you already know, Eli Whitney. Eli Whitney is credited, he worked for the Winchester gun company, and in the early 1800s he came up with a way to create what's called interchangeable parts. And if you look at this parts map, basically what this is showing is that this piece right here is the same on every gun. So is this piece, so is that piece, so is that piece. You make them with machines, they are precisely made, so that if this piece breaks, the trigger breaks, I don't have to go get a gunsmith anymore to go and repair that. I can go to the store, buy that piece, and repair it myself. Okay. He very famously went to Congress with, I think it was 10 Winchester guns, all jumbled up in pieces, and in front of Congress he put them all together, showing that interchangeable parts was a wave of the future. And in fact it was, because now if you look over here at the sewing machine, now if this little piece breaks, we don't have to stop everything and go and take it somewhere to be repaired. We probably have that part to go replace it with, and that sewing machine can be put back to work in 15 minutes, not a day or 2 days. Again, efficiency, it makes it cheaper, it makes production easier. And that's all part of the market revolution that is going on. Okay, so those are just a couple of inventions. Oh, yeah, see the result. It makes the production of goods faster and cheaper. Okay. All right, so we've talked about the transportation revolution and the connectability of America, at least especially the North. We've talked about the idea that the division of labor, or the assembly line, plus new inventions that make things go faster, is revolutionizing the way we manufacture goods. Now let's look at one industry, and we're going to actually spend a little bit of time on this industry. There are many industries developing, but this one really is the big daddy of them all. Just as in Great Britain, the textile industry is going to be the biggest industry in the United States, fed by all of that lovely cotton down in the South. And I'm going to just talk a little bit about the textile industry, and it's going to introduce change number 3. So you need a little background before we go. So The textile industry was brought to the United States by a man named Samuel Slater in 1791. He set up some textile mills, and you have a picture here of a restored mill that is the part of the Slater mills that were set up in Rhode Island. These mills were begun using large-scale mechanization, which was the first time that mechanization was used on a large scale in the United States. Many industries won't get to large-scale mechanization for a very long time, but the textile industry will get to it immediately with two inventions that are not American. These are British inventions. The spinning jenny, which allows you to take cotton and spin it into thread. So here is a restored set of spinning jennies in a restored old mill, so you can kind of see what they would be looking like in that mill there. And this is a power loom. This is the loom that is going to take all of that thread produced by the spinning jenny and turn it into cloth. And so you would have a room just like this one that was filled with the power looms. So Slater gets to work in 1791. He has the technology, he's got the building, he's got the idea, he's got his power. It was powered by water, and that's why you have the water here. There are, inside this room right here, there are big, huge water wheels that are driving the machines inside. So there's power running that there. But he's got all these pieces. So he's got the machines, he's got the water, he's ready to go. But his problem is what change number 3 is going to bring, and that is workers. One of the things that production needs, and if we want to have a manufacturing base, we absolutely have to have workers, and this was a problem that Samuel Slater didn't account for when he opened his mills in 1791. And so let me explain a little bit about why this was a problem during the first few decades of the textile industry and many others. And that is that there were a number of barriers to people wanting to go into work. And one of those was so much land in the West. Would you really want to work in a factory if there was land in the West that you could get pretty cheaply? Most young men said, work in a factory 14 hours a day, go west and see if I could get land. The answer to that question was, I am going to go west, which is why people were going west in such large numbers. And so what happened was there wasn't much of a workforce available. There were people who would come and work, usually poor people who would come and work for a period of time, but as soon as they got themselves financially on their feet, they would move out, and they would leave and probably go back to getting land. So you'd get poor workers who would come, but they wouldn't remain. And a lot of times Samuel Slater and others who were in the textile industry had to shut down their mills because they didn't have enough people to work. And they struggled for a long time to try to figure that out. And many people thought that this was the barrier that was going to keep the United States from industrializing. The wonderful benefit that America had, land, was going to be the barrier that would keep America from large-scale industrialization. Something even Alexander Hamilton had not thought about. So how are they going to solve it? Well, the labor problem is going to be solved in the textile industry, which of course was struggling the most trying to find workers. In 1816, a group of investors created a set of mills in a town called Lowell. And they created the Lowell textile mills. And here's a picture from the 1840s of the mill buildings that are there. Those look a lot like the Slater mills along the river. This is along the Merrimack River, and this water is going to run all of these mills. Here you can see a vision of the mills in the background, but also what it was that the Lowell investors were envisioning. What they wanted was an ideal working town where you had mills in certain places, but you had a workforce who came, worked in the mills, but also was there to take advantage of sort of parks and beauty and education and other kinds of things while they were working. The people they wanted to come and do this were young women. In fact, girls from the ages of, some of them as young as 13 to in their 20s or 30s were invited to come and work in these mills. And the reason these girls would go is that they weren't the young men going off to get land. They were the daughters of farmers who were in Massachusetts and Connecticut, who, because industrialization had begun to lose work on the family farm. Many young women, their job traditionally was to use a personal spinning wheel and a personal loom to sew cloth for their family. But as the textile industry began to mechanically produce that, that wasn't something they needed to do anymore. And so fathers thought very hard about sending their girls to this ideal town where the girls would live in a boarding house under the supervision of an elderly woman or an older woman who would guide them. She would make sure that they were taken care of. She'd make sure they got to work. They had a curfew that they would come back to. They would be given opportunities to go to lectures at night and do all these wonderful things that living in a town might give you if you weren't on a farm in the backcountry of Massachusetts. And so fathers would send their daughters because their daughters could earn money that would be sent home to dad, and girls went because it was an adventure. It was something that got them out of a place they didn't want to be for a period of time. So these girls are going to come, and here are some pictures of them and the conditions in which they worked. And they would be considered a temporary labor force. So all of these girls that are depicted here, these are girls from a weaving room. So they would be in one of these rooms working. This is a restored weaving room from the Lowell Mills. The Lowell Mills is a national park. Here's a depiction from the Times that shows you this. These girls would come, they would work for a period of time, but the expectation was that they would ultimately leave. That at the time when they were ready to get married, they would go back home to their dad's farm, find a young man that they wanted to marry, and marry him. So they're temporary. They come, they go, but there are always more young women to flow in. And so your labor force isn't like poor people coming and going that fluctuates with the way the economy's going. Now you have this flow of girls who are coming in, growing up, and leaving. And from about 1816 until the 1830s, this worked really well. And the textile industry will grow well beyond Lowell, and other industries will begin to use this temporary labor force. The other big industry that does this is the shoe industry. And so young girls in New England and the New England states are going to have this opportunity to begin to live in a town and move into factory work and learn about urban living. But then ultimately, they're mostly going to go home and become the wives of farmers. Okay? This satisfies the needs of the textile and other industries to have a labor force. And it didn't seem to be much of a problem, except in the 1830s, when two things happened. One, girls started getting tired of getting very low pay for very long hours of work. Girls worked 12 to 14 hours a day, 6 days a week. They got paid very little. Women always got paid far less than men for the very same job. And they felt that many of the things that the owners were doing to increase their profits were unfair. And they began to go out on strike. And while their strikes were not always successful, often they were forced to go back to work, these girls decided that maybe this wasn't for them. The second problem was there weren't enough girls for the number of textile mills that had been built. The textile industry had grown enormously, and they were outpacing the number of young girls who were available to come into the workforce. And so now owners in the 1830s are scratching their heads and going, man, there's still land out there. Many Americans are still going west. Where am I going to find my new labor force? Where is my second solution? The second solution is going to come from two groups. Those artisans who got kicked out of work, they were living in cities, they aren't working anymore because cheap division of labor jobs are available and artisans are not in need. If I can buy shoes from a shoe factory, why am I going to buy a very expensive shoe from an artisan? So many artisans went out of work and they were available as a workforce. But again, some of them went west, so you're not going to have a huge number of people. The ultimate solution is going to come in the 1840s with the arrival of immigrants. immigrants are going to solve the problem of the early market revolution. Beginning in the 1840s, two groups are going to arrive, the Irish and the Germans, and particularly the Irish are going to become the workforce of the textile industry. By the time you hit the 1850s, most young women are out of the workforce and Irish families are working in the factories. And if you look at census records, you can see the replacement of these American-born girls with women and children mainly of the Irish immigrants who have swept into these areas and are now taking up that job. Many of these were fleeing famine. What was called the potato famine began in the 1840s and continued on and off until the 1860s. And so many of these people were fleeing horrible conditions at home and had come almost in a way to save their own lives, fleeing their homeland and coming to the United States. And they are also going to save industrialization in America, because without these Irish and German immigrants, American industrialization could never have expanded. So they are going to become a permanent labor force. So now we're going to begin to see this group of people who are not going to leave. They're going to stay. They're going to be urban. They're going to work in the factories. Okay, so solving the labor issue, part 2, a permanent labor force. Okay. So that ends the discussion of economic change. So basically, I probably shouldn't have put this up, but you have that written down on your notes. But basically, to sum things up, what's happened is a huge amount of economic change. We've connected ourselves together. We've begun producing goods on a large scale. Those goods can move around on canals and roads. Americans are beginning to move into cities because they're taking up manufacturing jobs. Goods are much more readily available, so you don't have to make them yourself. So the North is seeing enormous change. And they're going to respond to that change. Their world is going to change in ways that they choose and in ways that they don't. And this society is going to become, as we'll see, a very different world than the world of the South or even the world of the North in 1790. So let's take a look at some of these changes. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at social hierarchy, which is what we did when we looked at the South. And we're also going to look at reform movements, which are kind of the centerpiece of the cultural difference between the North and the South. So we'll look at social hierarchy so you can kind of compare that with the South. And then we'll look at reform movements and the culture of reform and compare that with Southern developments of the pro-slavery argument and their idea of culture. So let's take a look at those. Number 1, cities grow, which is sort of obvious. If you have industrialization and you have workers have to go where the work is, and that means cities are going to grow. Urbanization is what we call the growth of cities. And I'm going to show you, here's a map of the United States in 1820, I think it is. And if you look where I put the red circle, you can see that most of the large cities are still huddled here on the eastern side of the Appalachian Mountains. There are a few large cities, but most of them the traditional cities: Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Baltimore. Okay, so we don't see any large-scale cities in the interior, and we certainly don't see any large cities here in the American South, just Charleston and, of course, the port city of New Orleans. But now let's take a look at 1860. By 1860, the year before the Civil War, you can see industrialization has expanded all across the North. You can see, in fact, the very clear result of the Erie Canal's creation. Look at along the pathway of the Erie Canal, we see these large cities developing. And these other large cities are developing in part because of that interior network of canals and roads that are being built. And the fact that here and here and here, we're beginning to also see industrialization occur. So people are moving into cities. Cities are beginning to grow. The world is becoming an enormously dynamic place. Urban areas are places of a lot of life and change and new groups of people that you're coming into contact with. And you can kind of think, a city is a place where you meet people, right? And please note, because this is a very significant difference, just as we looked at when we looked at roads and canals, you can see that we do not have any large cities in the South. right? New Orleans has gotten bigger. Charleston sort of has gotten bigger. We get one new city of Montgomery, which is kind of an oddity in the American South. But everywhere else, especially in the cotton growing deep South, we have no large cities. Okay, so of course that's true because we're growing crops and we don't need cities. We have rivers to put our cotton on, and our cotton can be exported to the world, and all goods can be brought to us from the world on those rivers. So why in the world would we ever need a transportation network or large cities? Okay, so that's a huge difference between North and South. Okay, so let's look at a couple of other things. We're now going to look at social hierarchy. Just as in the South, we looked at the social hierarchy of the South, and we said something about that. We said that in the South it was based on wealth, and it was based on the ruling class and the slave class. But the social hierarchy of the North is really only based on wealth. There is certainly discrimination against certain groups of people, but there is no ruling class and slave class with an absolute divide. Anybody, if they get rich enough, can move into the wealthy class. So let me just give you the list of the different groups, and we'll talk just briefly about each one. There's only one class, two classes actually, that I'll talk a little bit more about. At the top of the heap were the wealthy people who have taken advantage of manufacturing and trade. Merchants and importers who are buying and selling goods, importing goods, exporting goods, buying and selling the manufactured goods and sending them around in the networks to consumers. But also we're going to begin to see a rising class of wealthy manufacturers. So anybody who's engaged in the textile industry, the shoe industry, the iron industry, these are going to become our new wealthy people. Most of these wealthy live in cities, in those new urban areas where goods are available and opportunity is also available. You also, though, have an older class of people. We still have rural wealthy folk. They're not nearly as wealthy as the rural agricultural people in the South. But there are still, especially along the Hudson River and in some other areas, people who have old money, old wealth. Their wealth is based on land, and they're engaging without slavery in commercial agriculture. So they're still there. They haven't gone away. A new class of people that is rising are a group of people that are quite unique, and they are the urban middling class, or what we might call today the middle class. These are people who have moved into the city. They're not merchants, importers, or manufacturers. They are the people who work for them. The accountant, the retail manager, the supervisor of workers. These are people who come from rural areas, not the wealthy but rural folk. They move into the city. Here are some depictions of New York City in the 1840s. And they take advantage of that. And you can see in this picture, this is sort of an idealized family. And this is a pretty typical picture of an urban middle class family. These people are enjoying the changes that the market revolution has brought. They have more money, but they also are kind of different from people before, because these people rely on a wage to survive. They don't have a farm where they produce goods. They have to purchase everything from the market revolution. So they're really different in that fact. They rely on wages. We now have a large group of people who, for the first time, rely on wages for everything that they do. But because they're middle class, they're wealthy enough to have dad be really the only one who works. And mom stays home and engages in other activities with her children and with other folks, as we'll see. Okay, so this urban middling class is a brand new class, and it's one that is really going to grow during this period of time. And then finally, you've already met these folks, our permanent working class. These are our immigrants. These are our people who are working in factories. They too, like the urban middle class, are working for a wage. They do not have a farm to fall back on, but their status is much more precarious than the status of an urban middle class person. These are people who live in poverty. We now have not just a permanent working class, but we also have the rise in poverty that comes along with working for very low wages in the factory situation. Of course, this working class lives in urban areas, so the permanent working class and the urban middle class are sort of living side by side, nearby those merchants, importers, and manufacturers. And so those are the people who are living in the cities. As with what I talked about with the South, there are other classes of people, but these are really the basis of that. So a couple of general statements about the social hierarchy. This is not a rigid hierarchy. People actually, it wasn't very likely, but people could go from the permanent working class to a merchant importer or a manufacturer. It was known to happen, and many people with ambition who started here end up here. Same is true with the urban middle class. They can move up. The permanent working class is more likely to move into the middle class, and the middle class is likely to stay where they are, but they often can move in to the wealthy class. So this is what we call a permeable social hierarchy, not like the South, which had a rigid hierarchy. This one, it's flexible. People can move in and out. Their wealth will change that. Many people aspire to be wealthy, and they actually could meet that goal. Okay, so that's our social hierarchy. Okay, so the last thing we're going to look at, this is actually the last piece of the North that we're going to look at, is a cultural development that we might put side by side with the pro-slavery argument and traditional kinship ways of living in the South, and make that a comparison. In the South, people lived very local lives. They weren't physically connected to each other, as you saw in those maps. These are people who, in the South, don't move about very much. I mean, many people in the South were born and raised and died no more than 20 miles from where they were born. Okay, so they don't move about. They live pretty traditional lives within a social hierarchy that's pretty rigid and all those other things. But in the North, the changing society is going to have an impact on people, particularly, though not exclusively, the urban middle class. And this urban middle class is going to be inspired both by religion and by some of the problems that they see in the cities in which they live. And so let's talk about this idea of organization, building, religion, and reform. It all begins in 1812 with something called the Second Great Awakening. And if you remember, the First Great Awakening was a religious revival. So too is the Second Great Awakening. And it has a lot of the same hallmarks as the First Great Awakening. Religious revivals, big tent revivals, of which this is a picture. People coming to gain their personal salvation. Evangelical revivalism is a key to this. And it swept across the United States. People in the North and the South experienced this in equal numbers. And in the South, the Second Great Awakening was a very powerful way for people to reconnect with the church. In the North, however, the Second Great Awakening is going to have another impact, and that is ministers of the Second Great Awakening who have been themselves experienced the changes with industrialization, urbanization, and so forth, come to believe that this revival was not just about one's personal salvation, but the moral obligation of the saved individual to change the lives of others here on earth. Not just engage in my personal salvation, which is fine, but your more important job is not to be selfish and consider yourself, but to think about others. And there are many others, your minister argues, that need help. And so the idea of reform on earth is going to become a powerful message of the Second Great Awakening in the North. It is not going to happen in the South, as we'll see. So reform on earth. What I'm going to do is I'm going to look at, I think I have 6. I think that's how many you have on your list here. I'm going to look at 6 different types of reform, beginning with sort of the base reform, the one that started the reform impulse from the Second Great Awakening, and then looking at some other ones as well. So let's take a look at the very first reform impulse, and that was the idea of missionary work. Missionary work is the idea that you have an obligation to spread the word of God, of whatever denomination of Christianity you have, because we have all sorts of denominations arguing about which is the right Christianity. Methodists argue with Baptists and so forth. But whichever denomination of Protestant Christianity you're in, you likely were involved in a missionary society. And these here, I depicted two places that in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s, Americans would want to go. In the 1830s, missionaries went to Hawaii to missionize the native peoples there. Didn't have a whole lot of success for a while, but they discovered that this was a great place to grow tropical crops, and they set about very quickly taking over most of the land from the natives they were trying to convert, and started using sugar plantations and very rapidly converted the native population to the labor force of the sugar plantations. They continued their work in missionizing, but now in a different sort of circumstance, not as a community in a kingdom meeting a community of Christians, but now as planter and worker, almost slave. So missionary work was part of that, and it had, as you can see, some positive and some very negative aspects to it. The second picture you have is a picture, this is from Kansas, and some missionary work in Kansas. Native Americans across the West were exposed to Christianity through missionary societies. Again, just as happened in Hawaii, sometimes natives accepted this and many times they did not, but missionaries remained committed to the work. And in fact, missionaries were often the first Americans who arrived in the West. And as we'll see later with Oregon, it's those very missionaries who are going to put the call out to other Americans to come to the West and settle. So missionary work is the first impulse, and it's something that throughout the 19th century, missionary societies are going to go and try to convert folks to their religious point of view. Okay. Other things that were not so religiously based, reform, as it was called, was introduced as well. So missionary societies were one slice of the pie, but what most religious Americans who were involved in the Second Great Awakening really did, a missionary had to be somebody who was willing to leave home for a very long period of time, and not most people were willing to do that. But most people at home, in their middle class home in an urban area, began to create organizations to try to help create a moral society. And this was the big deal. Reform meant instilling a set of morals or changing things so they became moral through organizing private groups who would engage in activities to try to help people. Okay, so I see a problem, I join an organization, I help the organization, I fix the problem. I've done my moral duty as a saved Christian, and I feel good about doing that because that's helped with my own personal salvation, but it has also helped an individual or a group of individuals. Women particularly were very interested in moral societies and organizing. This is what a lot of these middling class urban women did when they were not, because they didn't have to, remain in the workforce. So one of the very first organizations, and really kind of the biggest one, was the temperance movement. The temperance movement was a movement to limit the use of alcohol by people. So what they wanted to do is they wanted to get people to stop drinking alcohol. The temperance movement was a private organization trying to change people's behavior. They had not decided that they wanted to pass a law. What they wanted to do was to engage in what they called moral suasion, persuasion with moral stuck on, right? So moral suasion was the key strategy of the temperance movement and will be a key strategy of any moral reform organization. They'll all use this idea. What is this idea? The idea is that what you do is you get a group of speakers. These speakers go around into the community and travel between communities. Usually they were men, but sometimes women, though women were not allowed to speak to a mixed crowd of men and women. They were only allowed to speak to women because women don't do that. They should never speak in public in front of men. And the temperance movement obeyed that idea. But all of these meetings would involve a speech that would encourage you about the evils of alcohol and encourage you to take a pledge not to drink alcohol. And some of the things that they did. So here's a moral suasion. Here's a group of women with a sign that says, "Lips that touch liquor shall not touch ours." So there you go. If you want to have a girl, meet a girl, marry a girl, you better not drink alcohol. Another famous broadside, and this actually was the basis of many of these moral suasion speeches, was what was called the Drunkard's Progress. And if you look at this, you can see step one is taking the first drink, and it leads to all sorts of bad behaviors: hanging out with women, engaging in partying, fighting with people, and then you get the height, and then you start to deteriorate. You become a drunk on the street. It gets worse. You begin to engage in crime, and then you end up committing suicide. Thus, at the end, leaving your wife and child destitute. So the Drunkard's Progress, sort of, there's a moral statement here, right, that says drinking alcohol is bad and it has these moral consequences to it. The temperance movement was enormously successful in the early 19th century. Alcohol consumption was reduced by roughly 40% during this period of time, as many people began to take the pledge and stop drinking alcohol. They do not, however, make alcohol go away, which was ultimately what they were hoping. So they'll feel not completely satisfied with their efforts at the time of the outbreak of the Civil War. But the temperance movement is going to set the stage for the methods and strategies used by many reform organizations. We organize, we identify a problem, we speak to people about this problem, we try to get them to engage in some kind of behavior that will help change, whether it's not drinking or whether it's setting up a safe house for women who are engaged in prostitution who want to get out of it, or other kinds of activities. And we're going to talk about those in specific. So temperance movement is the key to the way that this moral society was going to change the world. So here are some other reforms. As I said before, moral societies were something that were really big, and these were generally run by women to help women. Particularly, women were concerned about poor women who were forced into prostitution. What's very interesting about this moral reform society is, unlike many later organizations, these women didn't blame women for the problem and didn't accuse women of being somehow promiscuous and bad. What they saw were women in need, and they viewed the men who were using them as prostitutes as the enemy. And like this American Female Guardian Society, which I think was in Cincinnati, Ohio, there were many across the country. They brought girls in, young women into these communities, got them off the streets, helped them gain an education, and saved them from the horrors of prostitution. So again, privately done, all done with private funds. Another big thing in the North was increasing educational opportunities for all, not just boys, but for boys and girls. This was led, this public education crusade was led by a man named Horace Mann, M-A-N-N, but many, many, many people were involved in pressing local communities to open public schools for the first time. Schools that do not have to be paid for, that children can attend, and the financing is done by your local or your state communities. And over the course of the 1800s, public schools became the norm across the North. This did not, however, happen in the South. The South did not want or need public schools, and they rejected the idea that public schooling was something that should be available to all. Think their hierarchy, think the planter elite who want to stay in control. Why would I educate people? That might just make them dissatisfied with the position that they are in. And if you look at this picture, this is a picture of a women's college in the North, Oberlin, Ohio. And this is the class of 1849, women who graduated from college. This is not a co-ed college, it is a women's college, but it offered women the opportunity for a higher education. And then finally we have, next we have, finally on this slide, we have the women's rights movement. Many women got involved in temperance, got involved in education, got involved in many other activities. And as they did so, they began to think to themselves, wow, here I am doing all these things, and here I am participating in the transformation of my society, and I'm not allowed to vote. Oh, and I'm not allowed to own property if I'm married. And I'm not allowed to get a divorce even if my husband is abusive. And I'm not allowed to do this, and I'm not allowed to do that. And somehow that seems wrong. Here I am advocating for all of these people, but I don't have these rights. And so a number of women who were involved in the temperance movement and the abolitionist movement in the early 1840s began to talk together about this issue and struggled with how they could begin to advocate for themselves alongside the advocation of other people. And in 1848, in Seneca Falls, New York, a group of 300 people met. They actually met for, I think it was 3 days, to bring up and discuss the issue of women's rights. And this is a newspaper ad that says what's going to happen. So it's a convention discuss the social, civil, and religious condition and rights of women. Will be held at the Wesleyan Chapel in Seneca Falls, New York. During the first day, the meeting will be exclusively for women, which all are earnestly invited to attend. The public generally are invited to be present on the second day, when Lucretia Mott, who was a very famous abolitionist woman of Philadelphia, and others, both ladies and gentlemen, will address the convention. So 300 people came, and at the end of this convention, a woman named Elizabeth Cady Stanton stands up. She's one of the leaders, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and she had written a document for the group to sign. And this document was called, and I probably should have put it up on the board, this document was called the Declaration of Sentiments. And it was modeled on the Declaration of Independence. And basically what it did, using the language of the Declaration of Independence, it advocated for women's rights and listed all of the things that were oppressive in American society. And at the end of it, instead of demanding independence, what they demanded was the right to vote and participate in the political process. Because what they believed was, if they were allowed to participate in politics as individuals, they would be able to change many of the other problems that existed in American society. So they began in 1848 to demand the right to vote. This struggle, begun in 1848, will not be fulfilled until 1919, 72 years later, 1920, 72 years later, when women will gain the right to vote through the 19th Amendment. A 72-year-long struggle to try to convince men to vote to give women rights, because women are not going to be able to get the right to vote unless men vote to give them the right to vote. So this is going to be, it's the beginning of a very long struggle that will take generations of women to achieve, but they will achieve it. During the 1850s, not a whole lot was gained in the women's rights movement. A few states granted more lenient situations for divorce. The state of New York gave women more rights in terms of property. Interestingly enough, the state of California in 1849, when it wrote its constitution, gave women property rights, which had a little bit to do with the Women's Rights Convention. Kind of had a little bit more to do with the fact that women out in the gold rush were doing a heck of a lot more than other women were allowed to do back east. But women's rights was something that was a central focus of many women who were involved in these reform movements. So the women's rights movement begun in Seneca Falls, New York in 1848. The last, I think this is the last, of the reforms that we're going to be looking at are prison and insane asylums. Dorothea Dix was probably one of the most well-known reformers of her time, and she made it her job to investigate prison systems and insane asylums, which were pretty horrific places in the early 1800s. Essentially, prisons and insane asylums were places where people were caged and housed and treated in awful ways. And here are some photographs that kind of convey this. Um, Convicts who are put in hoods that are metal when they go out to walk. And in fact, in some prisons, you are left in that hood all the time. Here is you have to sit in this seat with this over your face because they believed that if you were restrained like this, you would behave better. This is a crib that was used on the insane to store them and restrain them. So insane people would spend all of their lives in something like this. And you can see the pulleys where convicts were housed. Okay, Dorothea Dix is going to begin the very, very slow process of beginning to recognize that the people who are housed in prisons and insane asylums deserve humane treatment. And so she will be a huge advocate for that and will begin to make the changes necessary. Again, just like with women's rights, it's going to take a very long time, especially with insane asylums. People did not understand the roots of insanity. They didn't understand psychology or the way the brain worked. And so many of the things people did, they didn't do because they were sadistic and wanted to hurt. They actually thought they were doing the right thing, and Dorothea Dix is going to disabuse them of that. Okay, so finally we're going to get to the end of things, and the last reform movement that I did leave to the last because this is the one that's going to cause the most conflict, of course, with the South. All of the above reforms that I've talked about and many, many others were all reforms in the North. None of these reform movements took place in the South. The South was not interested in reform. They didn't even have many of the problems that the North was experiencing because they weren't changing. And particularly, the abolitionist movement was violently rejected by the American South. But let's look at the abolitionist movement. The abolitionist movement in America was never more than about 1 to 2% of the American population. So it was never a large movement. People who said, I am an abolitionist, were few and far between. But the abolitionist movement was highly organized. They used a lot of the methods of the temperance movement effectively. And they worked very diligently to try to make change. So I'm going to look at very briefly one group. The American Colonization Society was really the first main anti-slavery society. And there will be people who will stay in this organization throughout the 1800s. But these were people who were what we call gradualists. They wanted to see slavery go away, but they were afraid to demand slavery go away now because they worried about alienating people. If you were somebody who was an anti-slavery person and a gradualist, you likely were a Democrat. And people who were in the Democratic Party tended to be worried about their fellow Democrats in the South. And they knew that Southerners would be, they wouldn't like the gradualist position, but they certainly wouldn't advocate or be very happy if Democrats right and left were advocating the immediate emancipation of slaves. And so the American Colonization Society is called the Colonization Society because their big idea was free the slaves and send them back to Africa. And they actually are going to create a colony in Africa called Liberia, Liberia for Liberty. And they will name their capital city of Liberia Monrovia after the current president at the time, James Monroe. Some freed slaves go there. Most freed slaves say, why would I want to go there? I am not African. I am American, and I wish to stay here. But there was a very small community in Liberia of American ex-slaves who go there. But by far the most important organization were the group of abolitionists. And an abolitionist is defined as somebody who is demanding immediate emancipation of slaves. If you're a gradualist, you're an anti-slavery person. If you're an abolitionist, you generally believe that slavery is immoral. It is wrong. It needs to go away now. And that feeling was housed in the American Anti-Slavery Society, which was founded in 1831. The head of the American Anti-Slavery Society was a man named William Lloyd Garrison, who's pictured here. He published something called The Liberator, which was an anti-slavery / abolitionist magazine. And his first edition, The Liberator, when the society came together, The Liberator, the magazine, was published for the first time. He said this on the top. He said, "I am in earnest. I will not equivocate. I will not excuse. I will not retreat a single inch, and I will be heard." And in that magazine, he talked about basically argued that slavery was an absolute immoral thing, and that it should be gotten rid of not tomorrow, not next week, but now. And he actually also argued the very radical thing that Northern Americans, simply by not arguing against slavery, were acting in an immoral way as well. That they were the cause as much as the Southern slaveholder, because they were quiet about slavery. They would say, "I just don't want it here, but what you do in the South is okay." And William Lloyd Garrison found that to be as immoral as holding a slave. And so he's a very radical man, and the abolitionists were very radical in terms of how Americans viewed them. And interestingly enough, because I'll come back to this when we do our last lecture on our last day of class, William Lloyd Garrison believed very strongly from a very early period that America probably would not be able to get out of slavery without blood being shed. He desperately hoped it wouldn't. He was a pacifist and did not believe in war, but he worried very much that this great evil could not be overcome without bloodshed. Other people who were in the abolitionist American Anti-Slavery Society, and there were a number, and these are 5 of the most famous of the anti-slavery people. All of them but one were speakers on the anti-slavery tours. Again, just like the temperance movement, the abolitionist movement engaged in moral suasion. They had people traveling across the country, sometimes even trying to go into the South, sometimes going internationally and speaking in England and other places, to advocate for the abolition of slavery. Garrison himself was a speaker. Angelina Grimke, who is depicted on the right of the screen, was a Southern woman. She and her sister were both the daughters of a South Carolina slave owner. And she came to believe, she was very religious. She was struck by the Second Great Awakening. And she firmly believed that slavery was not what God wanted, and struggled for years, being the daughter of a slave owner and being served by slaves. And she and her sister finally fled the South and moved to Philadelphia, in part because they did not wish to participate in slavery, but in part because when they made their wishes known, they were reviled by most Southerners. And in fact, Angelina Grimke believed that had they stayed in the South, they probably would have been killed. So she comes to the North. She joins the American Anti-Slavery Society and becomes a writer and a speaker on the tour. Frederick Douglass and Sojourner Truth had the same sorts of history. Both of them had been slaves. Both of them had escaped slavery on their own. And both of them became abolitionist speakers on the tour. Sojourner Truth was also a very strong advocate for women's rights, as was Angelina Grimke. They both were involved in the women's rights movement in its early years. The middle person there, John Brown, was not a speaker on the tour, but he was a radical abolitionist. Remember John Brown, because he is going to play a very significant role in the outbreak of the Civil War. He was an abolitionist, he was a radical, but unlike William Lloyd Garrison, who did not believe that he should engage in violence to end slavery, John Brown advocated as much violence as possible, and we'll see him engaging in violence in the name of abolition in the 1850s. So these are some of the people who were a part of the American Anti-Slavery Society. And what I'm going to do now on the last slide on abolition is just give you an idea of the different kinds of ways that abolitionists made themselves noisy during the 1830s, 40s, and 50s. Remember, they're not very big, but they're very frightening to the American South. And they are, because they're super organized. So here are some of the things that they were doing. This is a poster that is pretty typical of posters that were placed up in areas across the North. All men are by nature equally free and independent, have certain inherent rights, of which when they enter into a state of society, they cannot by any compact deprive our lives, their posterity, namely the enjoyment of life and liberty. And look at that language, and I hope you see the language of the social contract and the Declaration of Independence. They used a lot of the language of the Revolution to conflate the revolutionary leaders with the issue of slavery and make that connection so that people might realize that slavery was immoral and against American values. They also, as I said before, went on speaking tours, so this is just a piece that talks about, sorry, this is a, blah, it's getting late this evening. So they went on speaking tours, and you saw the pictures of the people who were going on speaking tours. They found when they went on speaking tours that sometimes they were welcomed and sometimes not. This piece is a pretty typical piece of anti-speaking tours. So, fellow citizens and abolitionists of the most revolting characters among you, exciting the feelings of the North against the South, a seditious lecture is to be delivered this evening. Go and protest, right? In 1837, the very year that this statement was made, an abolitionist journalist named Elijah Lovejoy, following a speaking engagement that somebody else was doing, he was there, he wrote about the speaking engagement of an abolitionist speaker, and people who were sort of riled up by this kind of thing found him, destroyed his home, and ended up murdering him, an abolitionist who spoke out against slavery in his newspaper. So speaking tours were never very easy, and many times the speakers had to really deal with a lot of this kind of thing, not just this sort of hatred, but also violence that was done against them. Another method of getting the word out were what were called slave narratives, and these are two of those. Frederick Douglass had brought himself out of slavery, and he wrote the story of his life, which was published, and many people read that and learned about the horrors of slavery through the eyes of a slave. Another one is one by a man named Solomon Northup called 12 Years a Slave. And if you've heard about or even seen the movie 12 Years a Slave, which came out last year, I think it was, this is the actual slave narrative that tells the true story of Solomon Northup, who actually was not a slave, who was kidnapped into slavery, lived in slavery for 12 years, and then was able to escape. And this horrified many Americans who read these stories. So this was a way of sort of giving you a view of slavery from the people who experienced it, and not from those evil white Southerners who tell us in their stories that slavery's all good and wonderful. So these are the counter to the pro-slavery argument. Another counter was the use of pamphlets, of which this is, okay, which these were pamphlets that were written and passed out and sold in bookstores that talked about what slavery was like. Uncle Tom's Cabin is an example of an anti-slavery novel, which came out in 1852. We'll talk more about that when we're getting closer to the Civil War. Uncle Tom's Cabin was a novel that depicted the horrors of slavery. So these are ways that Americans, especially in the North, were coming to understand what slavery was and what horrors that people experienced. And they were counters, in a way, to the pro-slavery arguments that the South was bringing in. Of course, the South was not very happy about any of these things. Many Southern sympathizers were involved in these kinds of activities. Frederick Douglass's narrative, 12 Years a Slave, Uncle Tom's Cabin, and these pamphlets were all banned in pretty much every state of the South. Northern abolitionists tried to send them into the South, and in fact the state passed laws that said you may not send abolitionist literature through the mail, and if you do, you will be arrested. Many of the abolitionist speakers had a price on their head if they came into the South, including Frederick Douglass, Angelina Grimke, and Sojourner Truth. So the South was not very happy at all about all of this noise that was going on. Okay, so the abolitionist movement. Let's finish, and I'm just going to kind of put all these things up here, and you can pause on these slides and look at them. What I've done on 2 slides is I've kind of given you a summary that will help you understand the attitudes and beliefs and how those play out in politics. We've kind of told you the story of these worlds, and now how does that play out in party politics? So you can see the different attitudes. The Whig Party wants to use the government to expand the economy. They support reform efforts, so they want an active government. They oppose expansion, mainly because they're afraid of slavery's expansion. Northern Democrats oppose reform generally because they want to stay in contact with their Southern counterparts. They are pro-expansion like their Southern counterparts. The Northern Democrats tended to embrace the working class, and we'll see that developing a bit more later. And Northern Democrats tended to be very careful about the issue of slavery again because they want to keep peace with Southern Democrats. So make sure that you get this down and you kind of have an idea of what those things mean as you're thinking about, okay, that's why the South does that, and that's why the North is like that. Okay. And now we'll look at the South, and I kind of did Southern Democrats and Southern Whigs. Southern Democrats, pro-expansion. They fear Northern actions to limit slavery. That's that fear factor. They support the pro-slavery argument. They do not support reform. And they also don't support national efforts to expand the economy. Think Andrew Jackson and his anti-national government stance. That's going to be seen in Southern Democrats as well. Southern Whigs, of which there were not very many, but there were a few, they tended to be pro-expansion despite the fact that Northern Whigs were. They were not nearly as worried about offending their Northern Whig counterparts as Southern and Northern Democrats were. They are not as unified. They do support national efforts to expand the economy because many of the Southern Whigs were engaged in buying and selling and trading goods. They were commercial agriculture folks that were engaged in some of the Upper South agricultural activities like growing wheat and rye and hemp and so forth. So they're going to support national efforts to expand the economy because that's good for them. They also were quiet about Northern Whigs' support of reform. This was not a big deal for them. It wasn't an issue. They just didn't do it because we don't have poverty of the sort that they were talking about. We don't worry about drinking alcohol. We don't worry about these other things. So reform was something they didn't pay attention to. Okay, so thus ends my lecture. I don't even know how long that was. You should be able to go back and review things, do this in bits and pieces. Hopefully this was informative and I didn't go too quickly, but of course you can go back on this one. Make sure you finish the assignment and do get it in by Monday so you can get the extra 10 points of extra credit. If you have any questions, bring them to class with you and we can go over those. We'll do just a really quick overview when we come back to class. Okay, thanks much, guys.